Hello, my name is Sauda, and today I'm going to be reading for you a book review that I wrote for Iran Reframed Anxieties of Power in the Islamic Republic by Narges Bajoghli. The book, just a brief overview, was written about the factionalism in Iran, and without further ado, let's get into it. The Green Movement of 2009, otherwise known as the Persian Spring by Western audiences, was reminiscent of factionalism and the divides that existed within the Islamic Republic of Iran post the 1979 revolution. This revolution brought Supreme Leader Khomeini into power and breathed life to a new theocratic republic. Narges Bajoghli uses a combination of narratives and anthropological research to relay how nearly 4 decades after the revolution, Iran's regime, with assistance from its media scene, is now moving further away from its founding theocratic ideals. The book succeeds in illustrating how regime media producers are realizing that gone are the days when the narratives of an archangelic regime should be prioritized over bridging the divides between the Iranian people and cultivating a sense of national unity and integrity. The book raises important issues such as the mistreatment and negligence of war veterans in Iran, the factional nature of Iran media that seeps throughout the population that consumes it, and the mixed feelings of military and paramilitary forces about the Iran they created. However, the book was particularly weak in addressing the unturned stones in the process of reframing the country. While it does suggest a reframing of Iran's political and cultural scene, it is no doubt that the wrongs of a country's past that are not amended tend to crop up even after the country is ostensibly reframed. The characters in this book, and more specifically regime media producers, do admit that they had a role in altering the war narrative, the result of which was a sense of exasperation and frustration from consistent narratives that portrayed the regime as the ultimate moral body in the country. These exasperations are what resultantly gave strength to the people to counter the regime's power by various means, among which were consuming and distributing anti regime films illegally and through joining organizations such as the Mujahideen Khalq, abbreviated as MEK. Even though the book does join the dots between the people's uprising and the regime film producers' mistakes in propagating flawed war rhetoric, Bajoghli does not explicitly mention the need for the regime to take responsibility for its crimes propagated against the guardians of the revolution. In particular, the book hints at a scene where the regime was brought to question about its execution of counter revolutionaries. This scene is, however, done away with as abruptly as it was brought up. The ambiguity that the book creates around this specific crime of Iran against its people, had it been eliminated, would have enriched Bajogli's argument that the country was truly in a process of being reframed. Without it, however, the book's title should simply be Iran Partially Reframed. While these shortcomings in the narrative stand out, a lot more is to be commended in this book. Bajogli manages to illustrate the various ways in which Iran's film industry, highly divided from within the country and even among Iranian filmmakers abroad, has almost rendered the Nizam, the policies of the regime that unite Basijis, Hezbollahis, and the Revolutionary Guard, are obsolete. The book sets the 8-year war between Iraq and Iran as the foundation of the post revolutionary Iran, and further goes on to argue that the narrative of the war had to be constantly rekindled in order to keep the spirit of the war alive. In this process, however, the intricacies of theocracies are buried under the rug, while evolved narratives of war are kept at the forefront. The role of nationalism, in particular, is highly amplified over religion, a force that was deemed ineffective in uniting a deeply partitioned country. With factions such as Khuda, Ghair Khuda, Khudi, Ghair Khudi, pro regime, and counter revolutionaries among others, the book was able to point at the unified priority of all these factions, the upholding of a sense of Iranianness without the religious implications of what it meant to be or not to be an Iranian. The regime film industry in Iran, as illustrated by Bajoghli, was willing to make compromises with regard to the role of religion in the country in order to be on the same page as the rest of the country, restoring symbols of nationalism among the Persian people and, in the truest sense, reframing Iran. The book's wide scope of events and portrayal of various voices does a good job in building an inclusive narrative of Iran. Bajoghli, in a scene that her protagonists jokingly refer to as the Arab Ku Klux Klan, criticizes the regime for leaving out the stories of counter-revolutionaries during the Green Movement. She embodies the same spirit throughout her book, bringing in the voices of feminists, anti-regime and pro-regime members of society, veterans, mothers, and many more while they talk about their visions for an ideal Iran. This is a strategic move and an effective one too, as it convinces the reader that, unlike the regime film producers, her inclusion of several narratives is an indicator that you can trust her story. In essence, it is Iran's holistic story of what a reframed Iran should look like. The book's final chapters go into a detailed discussion of the role of nationalism in reframing Iran, bringing characters such as Qasim Soleimani to the scene. One can only imagine what Bajoghli would have to say had she published the book a year later, following Haj Qasim's assassination. The collaboration of the regime with the younger generation that felt indifferent to it because of its monotonous rhetoric and mostly unwelcomed religious stipulation in the spirit of nationality now faces a huge challenge as the future of nationalism gets blurry. With the passing of a heroic symbol of nationalism, a major driving force towards the reframing of Iran, would this change what it means for the country to be reframed? The book was perfectly timed, almost begging a sequel, as it brews suspense among the readers and raises questions such as, what happens to Amir Tataloo's music videos among members of the RG now that the glue of nationalism that forced them together in the first place has been challenged?